whatever has been said by someone. And that someone was not saying it by themselves. They were saying it in relationship, so in response to others and anticipating responses from others. So when you start to see language in that way, it really shifts everything because it's not about getting it right. It's about getting it to be useful in the context of a relationship.
Hello and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abbie, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Pedro Martins as we take a communication perspective on researching and practicing therapy as social construction. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we embody curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So, whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Pedro Martins. Pedro is a Brazilian psychologist. He obtained his doctoral and master's degree at the University of Sao Paulo. He is interested in the practice of therapy as social construction in different contexts. And his main goal is to create generative conversational resources that bridge academic and practical knowledge. He works as a clinical psychologist in his private practice, and his research focuses on the workings of therapeutic conversation, particularly aiming to expand traditional individual practices towards more socially and relationally sensitive ones. This is the point where I will direct you to the show notes to check out some links that will connect you with Pedro's work. He has written a lot of great things, and you can also find him on Instagram where he shares some great knowledge as well. You may remember at the end of last year, one of the conversations I had was with Sheila McNamee, co-founder of the Taos Institute. And Pedro is someone that I got connected with through her. So this is a kind of continuation of that conversation in some ways, or it builds on it at least, as we continue to talk about social or relational construction as a perspective, as one option for one way of being and making meaning in the world. And I just find this so compelling. So I'm really excited to share this conversation with you today. And let's just do it. Let's begin the conversation with Pedro. Hello, Pedro. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Abbie. It's so good to be here. Thank you for having me.
So good to be in conversation with you. I'm really looking forward to talking with you today. And before we jump into it, I want to start with the question, how are we arriving? And I'll give you a second to think about your answer and start by sharing that I am arriving fresh off of a conference. I just arrived home yesterday, and it was actually a gifted education conference in Arizona because the CMM Institute has these really amazing resources called Cosmo Activities, and we just got to give away our resources for free, and people were so excited to receive what we had. And, I kind of had to perfect my pitch of standing there at the table, people walking up saying, here's what this is all about. Conversational activities, bringing kids into the creation of the social world of the classroom. And it just, people were really excited. And so I'm kind of bringing to this conversation that kind of unique mix of exhaustion and also energy that I got from being around so many people who were so ready to learn and so engaged. So maybe a little tired after a big week, but also really excited to keep the really good conversations going. So that's how I'm arriving. Pedro, what about you?
Well, it's good to hear that you're both energized and tired, because I could say same here, but I feel like that's my basic mode of working in life because I'm always so excited about what I do. And, I'm always involved in more projects than I should. And people are inviting me here and there. And I'm like, yes, that's a nice conversation. That's a nice conversation. And of course, tiredness comes from that. So I share that with you. but also I'm just recovering from this big cold or the flu or something. And it really hit me hard. My voice still sounds kind of funny. And in the past 2 days, I've been feeling better. And I'm just like, oh, so this is what it feels like to be me again. And
Mm-hmm.
so today I've had sessions with clients where I was feeling fully present again, not in my head, not having to worry about coughing or, just being sick. It felt so good. So, in a sense, I'm kind of tired, but also really excited to feel like myself again and talk about ideas that are really important to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was it feel like the kind of sickness where you really had to slow down in a way that makes you forces you to do that?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And it's so funny how you just get used to it in a sense, like feeling bad or feeling sick. And then when it's not there anymore, it was just surprising. It was like, oh, so that's how life could feel. So that's really good.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I'm glad to hear you're feeling back to yourself for this conversation today then. And let's keep going on the train of getting to know you. If you would introduce yourself to us. We understand that, you are a full human with a rich, complex story and life. And we have just 1 hour together today. So I'll let you decide for yourself. What do you want us to know? What feels important for you as we go into this conversation today?
Yeah, so I was actually thinking about that. And years ago, a good friend of mine, and he's also a colleague, he's also a psychologist like myself. He told me that I was someone who walked a fine line between doing what I have to do and doing what I want to do. And
Hmm.
I thought he was so spot on that because, I feel like that's how I've been leading my life, both personally and professionally. So that's how I went to study psychology in my undergraduate studies because I just felt like, there's something there. It sounds like fun. Let's see
Mm.
what's there. And I've always been this kind of nerd who's eating up all the books and talking to all the people. And it was actually a lot of fun. And then at some point, I met social construction and it turned my head around. And I was like, I need to understand more of this. So, okay, let's get a master's degree. So I need to talk to everyone. I need to really dig into this. And so, my master's degree was all about that. And it was also a lot of fun. And of course, I really enjoy writing. So I'm thinking about this stuff and I'm thinking, perhaps someone could also find this interesting. Maybe I'll write about it. So
Mm.
I'm publishing and just because it was fun. And then in my PhD, which came next, I was just thinking, I think I was more mature and also social construction. I had wrapped my head around it for a bit. So I was thinking, I really, really love therapy. I want to be a therapist and I also want to teach therapy. So I need to do something that's meaningful in that way. I want to study real life therapy. So that's what I did, So I just feel like my life has been rolling in this sense of, what I have to do and how can I make that fun?
Mm.
And since then, it's been a long ride. I am a therapist today. I'm a psychologist. I work in my private practice and I have found a way of teaching here and there where people want to listen to something that I might have to say, writing. So I consider myself a researcher therapist or a therapist researcher. That's where I would position myself.
Mm-hmm. Immediately, what I want to know more about is this kind of two-parted question I love to ask, especially people who are so obviously passionate about the work they do. That's, I wonder if you can take us back at all to your teenage self deciding to study psychology in your undergrad. If you can articulate what was it that interested you initially, and now what keeps you interested? Why have you stuck with it? What is it about your field?
That's a good question. So, a little background, my mother is actually a psychologist.
Mhm.
And so I think I was brought up with this sense of understanding about the existence of something that is not immediately there. So
Mhm.
she's looking at emotions, she's looking at how people react. And I have always been very sensitive to these kinds of things too. So it was there. And in Brazil, it works a little different than in America. So you don't just go into your undergraduate studies and then you decide. You have to decide beforehand.
Okay, okay.
So in my high school, I already knew that psychology was what I was going to do. It was a no-brainer. I didn't have to go through much thought. There was a point where I was considering journalism as well. And today, looking backwards, I see that it has a lot to do with how I see psychology right now, which is it's all about stories, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, in a way or another, I was interested in stories, in how people tell stories, what kinds of stories, impact people's lives. So I think I could have done that as a journalist or as a psychologist, but that's where life took me. And that's where I see it, like really trying to create better stories in the world, like you do in CMM, right?
Yeah, exactly it. And how about now? What keeps you in this field?
Well, I will often say that whenever I'm talking to a client who might be an individual, a couple, or a family, maybe a company, sometimes a school, the Pedro that goes there is the best version of myself.
Mm,
So I really like who I become when I am practicing, which is this very curious person. I am so curious to learn more about another person's experience. I am also really appreciative in my listening, which is not always the case in my personal life. I'm very
sure. Yeah,
critical.
yeah,
So I like that person. And I don't know, I have some kind of talent if you may to really connect with people and maybe helping them see something in their stories that they're not seeing, maybe looking at things from a different perspective, maybe rearranging or reorienting themselves toward life. That really, it's really fulfilling. So I think that's what keeps me doing it in the practice of therapy and psychology in general. And also, when I'm teaching about it, I've realized that somehow I can make these stories interesting for other therapists.
mm,
And I just really love being able to tell a good story about
yeah.
something that is so serious and so
Hmm.
it can be heavy at times. But how do you tell a good story about that so you will inspire other people, so you will help them feel more invited into that practice? So those are my two things that keep
Yeah,
me here.
yeah, yeah. I'm so curious to know about those stories. Do you have one that you could share about what's a kind of story that you tell as you are training people or teaching them about social construction and your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I was being trained as a therapist, there were these theoretical texts, right, that would dig into concepts and stuff and really important texts. And also there were these research texts which would say, so this is how therapy should be done, this is how it works, and etc. And they were really helpful, obviously, but at times it was so boring because for
Yeah,
some
yeah.
right, it doesn't really capture the richness and the aliveness of real life interaction.
Hmm.
Uh, so that's something that's stuck with me for a long time. And I was often thinking, you know, this is not at all how I feel when I'm with someone, when I'm
Mm,
practicing.
yeah.
And so I decided to start trying to tell stories about how practice goes that would feel more alive, more like would capture the colors of what
Yeah.
actual interaction feels like. And so I think that's one point. And then the other was in this world of research and also practice, there is this thing where you just tell the stories that went fine. So
Mhm.
this is this is how it works. I was perfect here, and things just sound so magical. And it's like, oh, one intervention and
Mm,
everything has changed. And obviously, that's not how it works
right.
in real life. And so I started to tell stories about how, fucked up things could be.
Yeah.
Like how I was stuck in a conversation and I didn't know what to do.
Mm,
And how, sometimes I would just say something and then immediately go, oh my God, that I should not have said that. And that really resonated with other professionals,
mm,
especially young people who were second guessing themselves, who were feeling like, I'm not practicing correctly. I have to hide that from my supervisor because they're going to think I'm not a good therapist. And so, just telling these stories where you mess up or actually where you just become a human, I
yes.
think that really, really, really made a difference. And it really connected with people. So that's what I've been trying to do.
That's so beautiful. And, I know that you being familiar with CMM will recognize the very name of this podcast being a reference to the loop model. And I just am so, so curious about all those yous and the untold stories. And I just feel so strongly that the stories that we're maybe the most scared to tell, because that is not an easy thing to do, what you just said, to tell the stories where you maybe don't look so good or it's a little messy or you got something wrong. That's really hard to tell. But I think those are the stories we most need to hear. So I absolutely believe and can kind of put myself in the shoes of the people you say you work with and what it maybe meant to them to hear those stories in a space where those are not the main stories that are being told. And so I just think that's probably something really, really meaningful that you've added into the space as far as telling these previously untold stories in a way that empowers other people to do the same. It's just like, seems like the center of a huge ripple effect.
Absolutely. I'm going to share one of those stories with you, if that's
Yeah,
okay.
please, please.
Because I just realized that's how I first stumbled upon this understanding that telling the stories that are not told, the things that went wrong, was really powerful. So, right after I graduated, I was starting my master's degree, and I went into this family. There was a family who we were seeing in a hospital, which I was part of. And my supervisor was with me, and she just said, we're going to be on a reflecting team. So if you want to join, that's fine. You don't really have to say much, just, and the reflecting team. It's kind of this thing in family therapy where you create positions of some people are talking while other people are in a position of just listening, and they
Mm-hmm.
have the right to listen. And then we shift
Okay.
positions, and
Yeah.
then someone's listening to what we were reflecting on the previous conversation. So it's really a way to expand meanings and,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
sort of try to create multiple understandings of the same situation. So there I am. It's my first time ever with a family. My supervisor is with me in that reflecting team. And then there's this family, this couple actually, who are talking to these therapists. And it's a really, really difficult life that they've had. He had a diagnosis of bipolar humor disorder. So he had this really intense depressive crisis and then really intensive euphoric phases. He would sell the house, he would crash
Mm-hmm.
cars. So there was all sorts of things. But that day, that particular day, the family was talking about how things had been better for a while and how grateful they were for that. So when they invited us in the reflecting team to reflect on that, my supervisor started and she made comments about some stuff. I don't even remember because I was so nervous. I
Yeah.
was just
Yeah.
thinking, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then when she said, "Okay, do you want to share something?" I just go, I was listening to this as a story of a family who has survived and maybe thrived, and it's so beautiful to see how that shifted over years, even with everything that's happened. So it was a small comment. Nobody said anything about it, and that was fine. But then in the end of that, one of the therapists who were in the room, she was so mad at me. She was saying that I was spinning the story and that the guy was a horrible guy and all these horrible things, which were not untrue. It was a really harsh story, but
Yeah,
she was
yeah.
saying you were spinning it. You were saying all these appreciative stuff, and you should not have. And I felt so bad. And even though everybody else was like defending me, it was
Hmm.
my first time, and I was feeling
Yeah.
awful. Right? Okay, so I'm dealing with that, and then a couple of months later, I'm interviewing the woman from that couple,
Hmm.
and I'm asking her, about her experience in the hospital. And one of the questions that I ask is, did you have an arresting moment here or a very remarkable moment? And then for my surprise, she goes, "Oh, do you remember that day when you were part of it?" And I'm like, "Oh no, I can't believe she's talking about that." And then I said, "Yeah, of course." And then she goes, "Well, that day it changed my life." And then I'm like, "Oh, really? What happened there?" And she said, "Well, remember when you said you described us as a family of survivors, of people who had gone through a lot. And even though those things were happening, we managed to raise our kids fine. And now we're living in a better place." So that really changed me because I had never heard anyone talk about me. That was the first time. And I felt proud. And inside, I was like, this isn't recorded. I have recorded this. I'm going to show that other therapist, so I was
Yes.
really
Mm.
happy. And then just one further step into the story, I'm sharing this with Jack Lenneman and Sheila McNamee, who were my mentors at the University of New Hampshire. And then I'm telling this story, and then Jack, who is this amazing human being, he says, she's telling you that you've changed her life, but when she does so, she changes your life.
Oh, yeah.
And so that really stuck with me. And I was thinking, it's not that
Yeah.
the reality is that I've changed her life. She was telling that to me.
Hmm.
And it's not real that that other therapist was a bad person. That's not what I mean. So I decided to write about this experience. And then I wrote an article about it. And it was really simple, just telling this story about how a meaning of something that you say in therapy, it's not ready. It
Mm.
depends on how the other person responds to it. And that meaning can shift in every new context of interaction that you go into. So first it meant a very bad thing that I did, and then it meant changing someone's life, and
Right.
then it meant changing my own life. So I was just showing that point and showing how that changing meaning also impacts your feeling of competency.
Yeah.
And then, really simple article, and that really struck a chord.
Hmm.
I never thought it would, but people
Yeah.
would actually come to me and say, "It's so comforting to read that." So that's where I first realized, like, telling the real life stories,
Hmm.
how important it is, and not just pretend like you're something, like that great person who never makes mistakes.
I think it's so important, like you said, to say that it was another therapist, I think you said, who critiqued you originally, that person is not wrong or bad, but it sounds very much like they did not have a perspective that was rooted in social construction, because they were saying this is the meaning of
Yeah,
what the story we're hearing. You are making spinning, you said you're making different meaning out of it, and that's wrong. But a social constructionist, a CMM, a communication perspective, would acknowledge what you learned along the way, then that no, there's a lot of different meaning to be made. And so I maybe use stories kind of broadly, because I see a number of stories in what you're saying, that the people that you are working with have their own story and have been told a story in the maybe work that they've done with other therapists. You offered them a new story, not even knowing that it was a new story, or that you were, going to have that effect in what you said. And then, like you said, her coming back to you changes your story. So I'm just so curious about this interplay of the stories and how they happen relationally. And I know that you've written about this kind of idea, that language I pulled right from an article you wrote is language is not representative, but constitutive. And I just feel that so strongly. And I wonder if you could speak more to your experience of that and maybe get into a little bit what that means, just to not take that for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's one of the basic ideas of social construction, right? We take for granted that language is a mirror of the world. So
Mm,
whenever I'm trying to describe something, I have to get the right language for it. And so the right language is one that's clear, it's one that's true,
hmm
and it's one that's absolutely, there's no second guessing there. So that's a representation. So it could either represent objects in the world or internal feelings. So, how are you feeling? And then you have to get the right words.
Yeah.
That's the traditional view of language. And of course, social construction and CMM are going to see it differently, right? We understand language as a social device, one that's actually an action in a relationship.
Mm,
So whenever I'm describing something, I am stepping into a kind of discourse, but I could step into a different kind of discourse that's always a choice. And if I language something one way, it's not an accurate representation of something that's out there. I am
hmm
actually creating that something as I describe it. And so it sounds confusing at first, but also it's so liberating because you start to realize that the world, first of all, it's multiple.
hmm
And second, it is made by people. So whatever has been said by someone.
hmm
And that someone was not saying it by themselves. They were saying it
Right.
in relationship, so in response to
hmm
others and anticipating responses from others. So when you start to see language in that way, it really shifts everything because it's not about getting it right,
hmm
it's about getting it to be useful in the context of a relationship. That doesn't mean anything goes, right? I
hmm
can't just make up language and just say, from now on, I would like you to call me the Queen of England, not the King, the Queen. And not just call me, but I am just going there to Buckingham Palace and I'm
mm
moving there. Okay,
hmm
so people are going to hospitalize me if I say that
Yeah.
because there is no social sustenance for that version
Hmm
of a language. But let's dig into something more close to home, at least to me, and meaningful. So, say I ask you, how are you feeling? And then you could say, many things in response to that. So it depends on who is asking, it depends on when it's being asked, it depends on the context where it's
hmm
being asked. So it's not just one thing. Your response doesn't just mirror your internal states of feelings,
hmm
it is part of a relationship that we are creating here. So I am just as much responsible for the creation of this meaning as you are. And so that changes everything. It makes you responsible for the conversations that you have. It makes you responsible for the understandings that you're putting out there in the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
So it's a call for responsibility.
Yeah, yeah, that's really beautifully said. And I know that, we are share a passion about making all of these things really practical for people. And this is just getting me thinking, I'm looking at it on my screen because I wrote out the quote to make sure I got it right. Language is not representative, but constitutive. And I'm just interested in, yeah, I'm getting really, into the minutia of it. But the thing that I'm thinking about is because I have this communication perspective that feels very embodied for me now, like it just is baked into everything, every experience I have, I'm bringing this with me. So I buy into that. But as I'm thinking about my younger self and the world that I grew up in, where this was not modeled for me at all. I did not have the psychologist parent who, I kind of said, even prompting you, okay, take us back to your teenage self. And this moment, and you said, well, it goes way back beyond that. For me, it was my kind of teenage self going to school, beginning to study interpersonal communication, where this kind of shift happened. And before that, I would have believed that language was representative because it actually was, or it felt like it was in my world. So I think I'm really curious about trying to make that distinction, because I do want to believe that it's not representative, it's constitutive. But if you don't have this kind of social construction, a CMM perspective, then it can still feel representative. And so I wonder what the kind of bridge is across those
Yeah.
two ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me tell you something. Growing up with a psychologist mother does not mean that I understood
Sure.
language as constituted.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
traditional psychology, which is what she practices,
Mm.
we're very different kinds of psychologists. We
Yeah.
respect each other, but it's different worlds.
Okay.
So it's like, this is the language that represents human beings. This is the language that represents internal states. So, and I was a nerd, right? So I got it right. I just really knew it. And actually, it was kind of interesting to go and study psychology from that perspective, because I was so sure of everything.
Mm.
And in psychology, you have these different theories, right? So you have psychoanalysis, you have CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
have Gestalt therapy, you have, person-centered therapy. So there's all these different descriptions of human life. And they're fighting against each other. They're like, oh, I've got the truth.
Mm.
So the unconsciousness, it exists. I can prove it. Look at here. And then CBT goes, no, there's no unconsciousness. There's just something that's outside your conscious perspective right now, where you're
Mm.
focusing. And so it's really different. And there's this ongoing war that goes on forever. And I just went into that battle, like, ready to defend my mother's position. Because I had grown up with that. I knew exactly what the truth was.
Yep.
And so I'm studying these other things, and I'm very skeptical about all of them. And I'm just thinking, this is why you're wrong. And then, oh, this is why you're wrong. And that's when I meet this professor. His name is Emerson Hazeda. He is my co-author with Sheila McNamee of the book Practicing Therapy as Social Construction. And then he was different from everything that I had seen before. He was coming from a social constructionist perspective. And when somebody would say something in the lines of truth, instead of just saying, no, that's not how it is, this is how it is in my perspective, he would just be very curious about it. And he would just ask questions from within that kind of discourse to make us not take it for granted. And he did it with me. And I remember thinking, this man sounds completely crazy. But at the same time, he's not,
Yes.
So
Yes.
something there. So what I want to say is, what first touched me in these ideas was not really the ideas in itself, but it was the stance that he had and what that did to a classroom. So it was a completely different environment from everything else. And so I was thinking, I have to learn more of that. And of course, everything changed from that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not familiar enough with the world of therapy to know if this same kind of language exists, but I can picture this little graphic in the top of my Calm Theory textbook. Each chapter was its own theory, and there was this little graphic that showed you where on this scale this theory fell, and the scale was objective to interpretive. So I don't know if theories are kind of categorized in the same way in your field, but CMM is obviously more interpretive. But how I remember, at least the definition, the distinction between those two is in terms of truths. And so this is what made me think about it as you were using this language of truth, that, interpretive would subscribe to this idea of pluralistic truths. It's the little t truths. Each of us have our own or have multiple within ourselves. And it is more like something we create, whereas the objective perspective is interested in the capital T truth that is somewhere out there to be found. And so that's kind of the distinction that I hold in my head. And definitely, obviously, working with CMM, feel much more on the interpretive side. And I, could exchange the word truths for stories. And so it just does feel so important to me to hold that space for all of our own little T truths, all of our own stories, and to learn, because I think maybe both of our different but similar experiences are reflecting that it is for many people something to be learned, that these stories can coexist with each other and that you can approach them with curiosity like your teacher did, in a way that you can kind of pick up on and feel the difference of.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's just one thing that seems a little different from what you had described in communication as opposed to psychology, which is usually the people who are more open in the field of psychology, they will consider that different theories are grasping different parts of the big T truth. So I am seeing this part of the truth, and then you're seeing that part of the truth, and then you're seeing the other part of the truth. And that's not really what social construction or CMM is saying, right? We're saying, whenever you describe something, you are creating a kind of truth,
Right.
a small T kind of truth. So I think that in psychology, the worst version of that is mine is right, yours is wrong, you must be destroyed.
Yes.
The good version of it is, we are talking about different parts of the truth and we can coexist. And then to me, particularly from a social constructionist perspective, the better version of it is, and of course it's just one version, right?
Yep, just one
Which
version.
is, we are telling different stories about life. And some of these stories help us see some things and others, and close our views to other things, and other stories let us see different things. And so how can we move around these different stories, knowing that they're just stories, and knowing that they may help us talk to people or talk with people? So that's my perspective, I think. But if you're coming from a position of truth, it really bugs you to have someone tell you, okay, that is true, but in perspective. People really like to have the true truth,
Yeah.
There's this exercise. Can I share a story?
Please.
There's this exercise that I like to do with people I'm training, which is I take this snippet of a therapy session. So I position them in different places and I say, you're going to be the psychoanalyst. You're going to be the CBT people. You're going to be the, social Marxist theory people. You're going to be whatever, so different positions. And then I show them the same clip from a therapy session. And from each position, they have to answer what's going on there. And it's the same conversation, right?
Yeah.
Completely different interpretations of it. So if you're coming from a psychoanalytic perspective, you're going to be looking for the unconscious elements that are splitting out in conversation, and that looks real. That becomes real to you because you have the language for that, and you're describing what's going on in that way. And then you listen to someone coming from a Marxist position, and they're saying something completely different. They're talking about the historic conditions, the concrete conditions that create that kind of dilemma that the person's going through. And then someone else is talking about CBT, and they're talking about beliefs and the behaviors that come from that. So it's the same thing.
Yep.
Very different realities. Very different realities. And so instead of approaching that from a perspective of which one is better, or which one is the real reality, the true
Mm-hmm.
truth.
Mm-hmm.
My approach is what happens to the world when you describe it in those terms? What do what does that story help you see?
Mm-hmm.
What does that inspire you to do with these people?
Mm-hmm.
Do you like the effects of that? Who's gaining something from that? Who's losing something from that? And then I go
Mm-hmm.
around with the different perspectives, and what you have is like this multitude of possibilities. So instead of just closing them down, I'm inviting people to reflect on the effect of what they are doing. And, I just think that's really beautiful. It's really beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the CMM-ish question that I've reflected on a lot lately is just, what are we making? And
Hmm.
have, known about this question and have maybe grasped more tightly to different parts of the theory throughout my practice of it. But really recently, that question has kind of come to the forefront for me, where it's like, I'll find myself in an interaction and I'm thinking, what are we making here? Or in thinking about how am I about to respond to this? I'm like, well, what do I want to make here? And I just think that question is so, so helpful. And what you're demonstrating in the story is so different from other ways of being that have maybe been modeled for us. I'm curious to know more from you about, for maybe, those of us who are not as intimately familiar with all these different kind of approaches, what is a social constructionist lens to therapy offering? What is it doing? What is it making that other perspectives are not? Or what does it add?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Can I just say before answering your
Mm-hmm.
question that I really like that CMM
Yeah.
question of what are we making, and also the question that follows from that, which is how could we make it differently, or how
Yes.
could we make it in a better way?
Yeah.
Because I really like that it positions us to understand that we have options.
Yes.
And so often when we're in interactions, we're thinking, this is what must be done. So if so and so say X,
Yeah.
then I must respond Y. That's my only option. Uh, and I just think that's so limiting. And I really
Mm-hmm.
like that when you're reflecting that you're part of what's being created, of what we're making, it could be made differently.
Yes.
So I think that has a lot to do with what social construction brings into the table
Mm-hmm.
of therapy, which is this realization that therapy is not about content, it's about process.
Yeah. Right.
And that may sound weird at first because people get into the world of therapy really trying to understand what's going on inside people's heads. But instead, from a social constructionist perspective, there's this quote from John Schotter, who was a social psychologist, who will say, don't ask what's going on inside people's heads. Ask inside of what people's heads go on.
Mm. Yeah,
it's
that's a great, great reframing.
it's really interesting, and it's hard to say, but I
Yeah,
like the
I
way
won't
he
make you
frames
say it
it.
again. People could go back 15 seconds and listen to it again.
Yeah, so and I'm sure that's not the exact quote, but what
Sure.
he wants to do is, what if instead of looking inside people's heads and trying to figure out what's there, like the truth
Yeah.
of their feelings, of their beings, and then obviously trying to fix them,
Hmm.
what if we see therapy and psychology in general as this looking at how people's heads happen in a context
Yeah. Right.
and in response to that context. And maybe we could gain a better understanding of people looking at their interactions, looking at what they respond to, looking at, what we're making together instead of just assuming there's something inside there.
Yeah.
And I really like that perspective. So for me, a social constructionist approach, it brings into the world of therapy this understanding that I'm not looking inside of people. I'm not trying to fix people. What I can do is
Mm.
create this conversational space where perhaps, while we're talking, something new can, just uh, be brought about, and you can sort of become something different in the context of that conversation, which is a great CMM question, by the way, right? Who are we becoming
Yes. Yeah.
as we're talking? So that's one thing. And also, it reframes these different theories about therapy as discursive options. Instead of treating them as truth, they are just options that may help us keep the conversation going, create, generate ideas, and then maybe share with people and see how that help us make meaning about their lives. So, that's a very important point. And last, I'm going to say a social constructionist perspective is a critical one, in the sense that you are always thinking, if I describe things this way, if I make them this way, there's always a political dimension to that. So that is not happening separate from the world. You're doing it as part of the world. So someone's gaining something, someone's losing something from that perspective always. So instead of just pretending like we're neutral, we're constantly reflecting on, do we like this world that we're creating together? So, for example, if we together create this idea that there's something broken inside of you, and then, of course, because you're broken, then you must take responsibility for the wrong things in your life, then that creates a kind of world, right? That creates a way for you to look at yourself. And what if, instead of saying that you're broken, we look at what you're describing as a meaningful response to adverse social conditions?
Yeah.
It changes everything. And I'm not saying that one is right and the other one is wrong. I'm just posing the question, what happens to the world? What happens to you? What happens to me when you understand things in one way or in the other way? So we're constantly reflecting on that, and I really appreciate that political and social dimension of social construction.
I appreciate you framing it as you are reminding us of this really intimate relationship, because I, talk about my work as like translating almost this like world of academia where all these theories exist and these big words and ideas over here. And then kind of the everyday life over here, I feel like I'm translating, but those two are not entirely isolated from each other. And I know you talk about research as practice and this relation, trying to, a lot of what your work seems to be about, but reframing this relationship between research and practice. And so I'm curious if there's any kind of story you could tell as a way for us to really understand this distinction between what's created, focusing on content outcomes versus focusing on the process. Is there any stories or experiences you've had in doing research that has, really drilled this down for you and made this something you believe?
I think that the first response to that would be something that I have never done myself, which is action research, which is where researchers really come from that perspective of understanding that the questions that they're asking and their process of researching, it can directly impact the people that they're researching about.
Yeah, right.
And I'm doing air quotes here, right? Because they're actually researching with, and they realize that there are pragmatic implications of going into a community or talking to people. And, so the questions that you ask frame these people in a kind of way. And do we like that frame? Do people like that frame? So instead of looking at research just as a way of mirroring what's going on there, action research understands that there are some things that need to be addressed there with these people. How can my research help that? And I envy the people who have done that and who
Yeah.
still do it because it's so beautiful. And I think that's the better kinds of illustration on that. What I have done in my work was when I was doing my PhD, I really wanted to study a real life practice. So I was participating in this hospital. It was a psychiatric hospital, and the families of the people who were being treated there, there was a treatment for families. The
Mm.
articles are here again. And so we had this program going on in real life where families would go through different parts of that program as a way of, we're trying to help them cope with the suffering of the mental health suffering of people. And the thing about that program was they were not family therapists. They were not trained family
Right.
therapists. They were people who had some training in it, but otherwise they had lots of stuff to do. So there were medical doctors,
Yeah.
nurses, and occupational therapists, psychologists, and they also had to take care of these families. So they had some training. And then we were there as part, me and my supervisor, helping them sort things out. But the thing was, the families loved it.
Mm.
They were just so grateful. And things really seemed to shift for them once they went through that program. So I was asking myself, what happens here? What kind of qualities of interaction are happening here that really make a difference? So that's where my research came from. I really wanted to understand that. And I was heavily influenced from a communication perspective. So I remember that Jack Lenneman once told me, you are coming from this assumption, this social constructionist assumption that language creates the world, right? Show me where in text. And that really stuck with me forever.
Mm.
So what I wanted to do was I was recording the sessions that these people were having with the families, and I was digging into them and looking and saying, okay, so what's going on here? And using a theoretical frame to try to make sense of how this change happened in real life conversations, because these people are not using protocols.
Yeah.
They're not, just replicating some kind of
Mm-hmm.
theory, and something's going on. So that's what I did in my PhD. And I was very fortunate because telling these stories, people really seem to enjoy reading them. I think you've read
Yeah.
one of the
Yes.
articles about it. And I remember that one of my referees for that article said, I really enjoyed reading this article, which is rare in this field.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it is. So, that's one way of focusing on process, not on content. It's just
Mm-hmm.
realizing that through all the steps of research, you, the researcher, are part of that. So
Mm.
the questions that you're asking are framing things in a way, the methods that you're using
Yeah.
are creating a certain kind of story, the interpretations that you're giving it. So just being mindful of that and describing that in text is one way of doing it. And then, of course, now that I am a practitioner mostly, I try to do it the other way around. So I see my practice as a context of research as well.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I'm talking to people, of course, I'm really involved in that setting, but there's always a part of me that's asking myself, what's going on here? How is change being created? Who are we becoming as we
Yes.
talk? And every now and then I'm like, this is an interesting story that really helps me address that point in literature, in the scientific papers it hasn't been addressed. So maybe I'll write about this. And so I go back and forth between research and practice, trying to do it as one thing,
Mm-hmm.
but mostly realizing I just want to maybe inspire people. I don't
Yeah.
want to tell the truth.
Yeah. That's a really beautiful way to put it. It just, yeah, it's so obvious to me in your story. Yeah, what can be made when you reorient to focus on the process. And it's, a little, it feels like inception in this way where it's like what we are doing is focusing on the process, and how we are doing is it's like in our world, the content is the process, is I think what I'm trying to say for us, because that's the perspective we're bringing, to have everything be about the process. But I just find it so beautiful to focus on the process. And something you were saying earlier sparked this in me. And then as you continue to talk, I was continuing to think about it in terms of what you were saying about the research and the practice, being research as practice, practice as research, that relationship going both ways. I referenced at the top of our conversation that I just spent my week at a gifted education conference, and I found it so exciting to get to be in conversation with these educators who, what was being reflected back to me about what was so great about the resources we have, because what we were giving away, we had these physical copies of Cosmo Kids and Cosmo Tweens and their conversational activities and its scenarios that Kim and Merritt are the ones who originally created these with a huge team, a decade ago. And they worked with kids and said, what do you experience in your little kid social world? And so that's all the scenarios come from what kids said they actually experienced. And then they're both, but especially the Cosmo Tweens cards are about, okay, what are 3 different ways you could react to this? And then what would happen if you chose this? What would you make if you choose this one or this other one? And I've just always thought they're great resources, but I'm not a classroom teacher. I'm not, seeing that in the classroom. And so what was so cool was to hear from these teachers, especially teachers who are teaching gifted students, have neurodivergent learners, that those cards were so helpful for them to create a safe, hypothetical space for them to get a sense of how their students were making meaning or how they would respond. And then if need be, the teacher can, intervene, but intervene's not even really the right word, because it's not even the teacher who's, talking at the kids. It's about the kids being in conversation with each other. Well, let's explore a different option together. And it's just reflected back to me how important that was and what a shift that is in terms of the process, because one of the teachers that presented about these activities for us was saying, how much do you talk to your kids? And, she's kind of referencing maybe you're a parent or as a teacher, how much of what you say to your kids is a directive, is do this, go clean your room, pick that up, go over here. She's like, that doesn't actually count as conversation. And I was like, oh, wow, that really unlocked something for me. So this different way of being that is conversational, that is bringing even kids into the conversation and saying, well, what do you want to make? Or what do you think? Like, what a big gift that is, not just in this context for kids, but for any of us to be brought into that conversation and get to share our story, get to share our little T truth about what we want to create.
Thank you for sharing that story. It's so inspiring. And also, it makes me think about how things that we start taking for granted actually make a big impact. And it's so nice to hear how you saw it reflected in that experience. The way that you framed it, you said, let's explore a different option together. It's just so beautiful and it changes everything, right? Yeah. So it's really nice. And there's also something that you said that's understanding that expression changed everything for me when I was first in touch with these ideas, which was what counts as what. So you said that doesn't count as conversation.
Yes.
And the idea of asking yourself, what counts as therapy? In that book, Practicing Therapy as Social Construction, that's actually a thing. We start by asking, what counts as therapy? What counts as a problem? What counts as change? What counts as a person? So, when you approach life from that perspective, you realize that it's not the same. What counts as a podcast? What counts as a resource? And I really like that expression. So thank you for bringing it back, because it really helped me understand what these ideas are about.
Yeah, that I'm glad you brought that up as well. Pedro, what I like to leave people with is coming back to this language that CMM offers of better social worlds. And I actually don't want us to get into that, because I think our whole conversation has been an answer to that question. And I'd like to leave people with that to do their own reflecting of how would they situate this work and this conversation that we've had in terms of better social worlds. So I'll leave listeners with that question. But I'd like to offer you one last chance. What do you want to leave listeners with as they go away from this conversation?
Well, I just put myself into the shoes of our listeners, and I really hope they have a couple of hours after you left them with this question. Well, to me, I was just really grateful to be here. And this whole conversation makes me think about, how do we create conversations in the world that makes us feel inspired?
Mm-hmm.
I really like the idea of inspiration, and you talked about inception earlier, it's a good way of thinking about this, because there is always a point where you can shift things.
Mm-hmm.
You can always analyze the same situation from many different perspectives at many different levels, and that leaves you with so many options.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's something that I would like people to take away from this conversation. How could you do it differently? How could you do it
Mm-hmm.
in whatever it is, right? In a way that creates a better world, and whatever counts as a better world for
Yes.
you. I think that if people are reflecting on that, I would be really glad about this conversation.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a wonderful thing to leave people with. So, Pedro, thank you so much for your time and for this conversation. It's been really wonderful.
Thank you for having me. It was really good for me too.
Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. First, you're always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections, questions, and ideas. There are also a number of online spaces where you can comment, including the Stories Lived, Stories Told Instagram and the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all these places to connect are in the show notes. If you want to stay up to date, a couple things you can do are follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation, and subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to get every episode right in your inbox. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives, including our other podcast, Cosmo Parenting, and all our free Cosmo activities, as well as Cosmopolis 2045. There's also the CMM Institute Fellowship and the CMM Institute Press. We have so many great resources that we are so excited to share. Again, links to all of that can be found in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.